Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first video in what I hope is a long and successful playlist of Fractal Audio AX8 tutorials. Today we're going to be starting off with a general heavy metal patch tutorial that'll work for about any style. Don't worry if you're not 100% familiar with the AX8 just yet. You'll be able to come back and tweak this patch a little more to your liking when you become more familiar with the amp models, the cabinet models, and just the general layout of the processor. But my hopes is to show you the general layout, how to manipulate X and Y cab and amp switching, as well as the scenes to make a general preset that will work for a lot of metal subgenres. And I want to be using this Gibson SG here to show you just how versatile the AX8 is. This is by far my lowest humbucker guitar, and this isn't exactly a heavy metal beast. This is what I use for like classic and southern rock, but I guarantee you this thing is still going to sound like a monster through that amp modeler. We're going to be primarily sticking to Fractal's AX8 software, but before we get into that, there's a couple things you need to have set up. Number one, you need to plug your Fractal AX8 into some type of computer through the USB connection. Unfortunately, you can't use it as a dedicated audio interface, so if you're going to be playing it through powered monitors like I am behind me, you'll need an audio interface with direct monitoring. We're going to be running this amp modeler in mono out of the mic cable left mono channel into the audio interface. And you can do this in stereo, but I'm just going to show you how to do this in mono for simple recording types of applications. We'll also be able to have an effects loop output of this if you want to run this into a dedicated power amplifier and guitar cabinet, if you want to go that route as well. The last thing you'll want to check before you go into the software, though, is under the setup menu, make sure that the decibel padding is to your liking for your guitar. This will determine just how much the input of your guitar is clipping, and unlike output clipping, it isn't actually necessarily a bad thing to have the input flicker on the red. That's actually something you want. So for this guitar, I'm not going to have it padded as much as I will with my active pickup equipped Agile 8-string. So just play with that to your liking. You don't want it to be red barring the entire time, but a little bit of, tickling the red, as the creators of the AX8 would say, is a pretty good setting. So play with that before we head into AX8, and then we'll be ready to go. So we're going to start off here with a completely blank preset. And for those of you that are all familiar with a normal quote-unquote heavy metal signal chain, you'll probably already know that we're going to go in some fashion a boost pedal, an amplifier, and a cab impulse response. And that's basically the gist of it. So we're going to start off with that simplistically, and then I'm going to show you some tricks, how to branch out a little bit and put a couple other effects if you want to use some different effects for lead tones and whatnot. Starting off over here with the input and gate, I'm going to leave this completely alone before or until we get into the other more noisy parts, because I'm not entirely sure how much we're going to have to change that threshold, the ratio, all that good stuff to compensate for the added noise that we're getting ready to add to the patch. We're going to start off with our drive pedal. I'm going to come back to these, and we'll leave a block or two in between every one of these. That way we have room to add stuff as we expand. I'm going to put an amp block about right there, and then I'm going to put a cab block about right there. I'm going to go ahead and shunt every one of these in between. This will allow us to connect all of these blocks together just by a click of the mouse. And fairly certain there's a quicker way to do this, just to the end with a keyboard shortcut, but I'm not entirely sure. So we're just going to do it this way because you're not going to be doing this terribly often, I have a feeling. So with that, we should be able to hear our guitar. Indeed. And it started us off with the last amp I've used. So we got the FAS Brutals. That's a fantastic amp, and we're actually going to be coming back to it later on. But for a heavy metal patch, let's experiment with a couple amps. So one amp that I'm in love with on this thing is the Angle Severe 1 and 2. And for those of you that may be familiar with Ingle amps, probably know this is the Ingle Savage. The only difference between 1 and 2 is that there's basically a scoop that's been engaged on 2, and so it's going to sound a little bit different. So you're going to hear this for 1. So a little bit more mids in one. I like that one a lot. So let's start with that amp. After that, we're going to want to go to cab and choose which cabinet impulse response we want. Now, if we were in stereo, and you can still do this in mono, but I would recommend going stereo and mixing different cabinet impulse responses once you get one that you really like, because you can do some really nice mix and matching between different cabs. Unfortunately, you can't do multiple amp blocks in the AX8 like you can with the AX FX, but that's not something I really use anyway. But once you're familiar with this, I would recommend playing around with multiple cab impulses. So for a metal cab, generally I stick to a few, and that's something in the Own Hammer loaded Marshall cabs, the Citrus, which these are orange cabs, is really good. The rectifier cabs are great. These TV cabs can also be really nice. They are very bright, so be aware of that. The USAs, those are Mesa Boogie Mark series of cabinets, which can be really nice if you're looking for that sound. Some different rectos. The German V30, the Boutique, that is a Engel cab to my knowledge. We got another Engel. Just some of these are not extremely descriptive. I will link the AX8 wiki below, so you can look up and see what every one of these are modeled after. So let's just try a few. Let's go with the German V30 because I love me some V30 speakers. Not bad. Let's try the regular V30. Okay. And see what the regular German sounds like. I think we're going to go with the German V30 right now. We can always come back and experiment with it as we go move forward. You can keep that on stereo, or it doesn't really matter. We can stick to the left channel if we wanted to, because this is only left mono, at least the way I'm running it. And we'll go ahead and switch that to the amp. Let's make sure we're not getting any different noise or anything like that. So we got a cab and amp selected. Now what I'm going to do is choose a OD pedal, and there's a few that I like a lot on this. The FAS boost and FET boost are pretty good for already extremely high gain amps because they don't add a whole lot of decibel boost, but it does drop off the low end a lot, and that can be a great thing. But there's already a cut built into all the amps here, which does give you a bit of a cut to the low end. So I think we're going to go try and true and go with the T808 mod, or OD, not the mod. The mod's a bit more high gain. And this is a classic Tube Screamer pedal that's been modeled. And just like a real Tube Screamer, I'm going to cut the drive to 0, tone all the way up to 10, mix 100% level 10. And what this does is mimic those exact settings on a real Tube Screamer pedal, and that gives you a nice little cut to low end and acts as a clean decibel boost to your signal, and that really cleans up a already high gain amp. So here it is, default settings on the Engel amp without the drive, and with. See, we already got a massive improvement there. For really low tune stuff, right now I'm in C with not terribly thick strings. I've got Ernie Ball Power Slinkies on here, so it's a 48 on the low end. So if we were doing something like a 7 or 8 string, I would usually drop this down about a couple decibels. That would give you a bass cut, and so it sounds like. Not going to make a terribly huge difference with just this, so we're going to leave it alone for now. You can always come back and play with it as your heart desires. Moving on to the amp. This is a fairly decent high gain amp as is, but we're going to crank up the drive just a little bit. Some of these amp models do have an overdrive, and it depends. I really like the Mesa Mark series amps in this, and my general rule of thumb is to put input drive between 7 and 8 before I begin playing with overdrive. So let's turn overdrive down really low so you can see what the difference is. So this is really low. Let's crank up input. So So you kind of get a dry gain with that, whereas the overdrive is going to give you your modern metal shun jun jun sound. So it's kind of the way the Randall Satan does girth and grind, not exactly like that, but kind of a similar analogy to the way it's going. So I want to turn this about, yeah, 7.5, something like that on each one of them. We'll turn this a bit higher. Now, as you can hear, we're getting some noise in the background. So I'm going to go over here to input gate, and I'm going to turn down the threshold just a bit, because this isn't a very noisy guitar. And ratio around 3 usually works really well. It's not, you know, deafening as soon as you let off the note, and gives you some good headroom, some good space. You can also do this in another gate block if you so desire, and that can come in handy, but I personally just like doing it in this part, because that way if I'm, you know, changing to cleans or whatever, I still get a very consistent attack and release. Sometimes I'll turn some of these up depending on the genre, but this should work out quite nicely for now. Bass, mid, treb, we're going to, you know, play with those as you so desire. I like a little more mids in my guitar than a lot of metal players do, but let's try around the 7 or 8 settings. And just like a good old Gibson SG fashion, we're already going super sharp on the low end. Thank you for that 17-degree angle, Gibson. Presence is going to give it a little bit more of a sharper razor sound. So I feel like it was in a pretty good position. Now, all of these EQ options here are in the preamp. There are some amps, just like the Mesa Boogie Mark series, that it actually is an EQ after the distortion, and you'll need to use the extra GEQ option to further sculpt the amp. This is a more normal version, though, so that's not going to be necessary. This will get you 90% of the way there. Now, you have a couple really cool options. Boost is going to turn up your gain. And for some amp models, you can get them so high gain that you don't even need a boost pedal. So that's pretty cool. Input trim is going to change the input of your clean guitar signal or anything that's, you know, processed before it. But this is useful also for getting a high gain sound without using a drive pedal. Cut's going to get chop off the lower end. Really tightens up the bottom end of your tone. Fat's going to do the exact opposite. Get a little bit more mids in there as well. And bright is possibly my favorite, because you do get a, it's not sizzly, it's not hissy, but you get a lot of definition on the upper frequencies. And all that is going to depend on the capacity that you put on the on this bright cap here. So play around with that. You can get some really unique sounds. Saturation, I usually keep off, but it can be really nice if you want to get a very constantly high gain compressed sound. Gets a little more consistency across your picking. Not for me most of the time, but it is an option. GEQ, I'm going to leave this alone. I usually come back at the very end and start playing with EQ. I like to EQ if I'm recording more in my DAW than I do in this thing, but of course this can be really useful if you're going through PAs and whatnot. Preamp, this is where you can start really getting lost in the settings. For a novice user, if you're just now getting this thing, I would stick to these for the time being. However, if you really want to dive in and create sounds that have never been made before, this is where you change it. And I would say a lot of people aren't super knowledgeable about what every one of these different preamp tubes, the nuances between them. I'm assuming the same deal with the power tubes. But, you know, we can go through and change these 6550s, which I believe is what actually Zakk Wylde uses and replaces in his Marshall amps. We can change those to 6L6s. We can change them to EL34s, which are a bit warmer. I really like those 6L6s, so let's do that. Change cathode resistance, bias, the presence, depth, all of that good stuff that you would be able to, modify in a real power amp circuit in here. So I would recommend nailing the sound beforehand, getting really close before you would even think about messing with any of this. But it is there if you are a super tone freak. The power supply options are also pretty time consuming if you want to mess with those. I think they sound fine stock, but if you really want to get technical, you can always change the supply sag. I do really like a cranked tube amps sag that it achieves, so you might want to play with that if you're looking for just a balls to the walls cranked tube amp tone where the speakers are distorting and the amp basically has no more to give. That's a really nice way of emulating that. Speaker response, generally don't play with that much because it's in a pretty good curve in my opinion. Speaker drive, I do like to turn up a bit. Now this is the setting that emulates a cabinet at full blast. So the more you turn this up, the more distortion you're going to get from the speakers and the cabinet housing vibrating and all that good stuff. So at 0, this is going to be like a perfect ideal case scenario where nothing is moving. You're just getting the pure sound of the speakers. And if we crank it up a little bit more, and of course if you go to the max, now you can pretty tell what it's doing. And I really like it around the 1.5 for a realistic sound, and I think that's what a lot of people are going for. Obviously you can have a smooth, glassy, super modern, processing heavy tone if you want, but I like it to have this this human element to it where there are imperfections. So, and speaker drive does a fantastic job of that. Dynamics, this can also get very, very messy very quickly, so I would recommend just sticking to some of these more simpler parameters when you're just starting out. Back to cabinets, the proximity effect is also something I like to turn on, and this emulates how close, or the phenomenon that happens when you place a microphone closer to a guitar cabinet. So it doesn't actually say what we're using, but you can see a lot of these impulse responses have a mic name next to them. So you got the Shure SM57, I got an M160 there. Where is the Neumann 160, 121B? But as you can see, there's all kinds of mic names next to these. And the closer you get, depending on which speaker cabinet and which speaker model and all that, you're going to get a kind of a resonance frequency around a certain proximity. So you got about 120 is a realistic sounding proximity frequency. So without any proximity, you just got a normal room sound. When you turn it up though, now that probably sounds familiar if anyone's ever tried to record a guitar on a cell phone or anything like that, because that's that kind of resonance frequency that you're going to get. I do like that bumped up just a tad as well for the realism aspect of it. You can turn that off completely if you don't like it though. So this in a nutshell is a standard metal patch. I mean, this could work for you. But there are plenty more tricks up this modeler sleeve, so let's try a few. Let's say that you want to plug in to a real guitar cabinet power amp. Say you have all that figured out, or you have a real guitar amp that has an effects loop and you just want to change the sound of the amplifier. You can absolutely do that by putting in the effects loop. Connect it before you would go into a cabinet. Very unlikely that many of you are going to have a full range flat response cabinet. And even then, I'm not a huge fan of stuff like the Gemini Mission Engineering full range flat response cabinets, because no matter what you do, if you're going to put them in whatever housing, whatever environment, it's not going to be perfectly full range flat response. It'll be close, but me personally, if I were going to use this thing, I would think a real power amp or solid state power amp going through a real guitar cabinet's the way to go. Now, if you are going through a real tube power amp, you're going to want to disable the power amp simulation here. And that's going to be through the global settings on the setup here in the navigation menu. So that you'll have to play with depending on what kind you're doing. But if you have a solid state power amp that's just straight, adding wattage to your signal, you can keep it on. That way you can get the added bonus of sounding like different power amps, which is pretty cool. So this will go through the return and in on your amp effects loop or your power amplifier and into your real guitar cabinet. And you still have every amp and basically effect under the sun to experiment with there. So that's a really nice use case. So now let's get a little bit more creative. Let's say that we want a chorus, for some type of lead sound. And we can play with that for a moment and see what we want. I really like the analog sound. I think it's classic. It doesn't really get old. We're going to turn down the mix just a tad. That's pretty good to me. So that's all fine and dandy, but how are we going to turn it off when we don't want it? So there's a few things that you can actually do. So you can set this to a foot switch on your pedal itself, or we can save this as a different scene. So hitting the space bar here will turn it off. So we can save this as scene 1, and then we can go to scene 2, save it, and when we flip between them, we have a different scene. And when we flip between the two, we got chorus on and off. Now let's try something a bit more complicated. So we'll have this off on scene 3. Now the beautiful thing about AX8 is that even though you can't do dual amps, you can still have X and Y switching, which is really nice. That means in one preset, you can actually change between 2 amp models. So say you want a different amp model in your lead, or whatever the case is, or maybe you want to go to a clean sound, you can absolutely do that. So same thing with the cabinet, but for now, let's try a different amp. So going into Y, for some reason, it starts you off on a Bassman amp, but it's whatever. Let's go try out one of the Fractal Audio System custom ones. So this is one of my favorites, Modern 3. This is basically a dual rectifier on all the drugs, and it's quite fantastic. For whatever reason, we got all of our knobs at 0, but is what it is. Let's try 6L6 because that's a beautiful thing. A little bit more speaker drive and see what it sounds like. That is pretty nice, and this is a really good amp for extended range stuff, by the way. So we can save that as, patch 3, and we go patch 1, got the Ingle Savage, patch 3, we got the software designed Modern 3, and the Modern 1 and 2 are really nice. The Modern is kind of based off of a dual rectifier, red channel. 2 is more of a 5150, and this one is kind of more custom recto, just really high gain. All of these Fractal Audio System ones are very nice and worth looking into. So let's try the same thing on another scene with cabinets, and let's just choose another one arbitrarily. So I like this one, I believe. That is a nice sound, so we'll save that. And you can do about the same thing with every one of these effects. Sometimes I'll dial back on the drive pedal, or even dial up if I wanted to do a lead sound. So you can go to like the TS808 mod here, and you know, that'd give you a little bit more drive going into the amplifier, which would be good for leads and all that good stuff. Now you can also put effects, you know, before or after the cabinet, but I've got the effects loop here, so you know you're going to want to stick stuff back. Of course, you can move this at your leisure, so that's not a big deal. Just keep in mind that whatever you put after your effects loop, where this line is going, it's not going to go into your amplifier if you are using it in that way. So just for fun, let's make sure this works on my Agile 8-string with the correct padding. Not bad. Not bad at all. So, this is just a very, very small dip into the ocean of AX8. I've definitely achieved better sounds than what I just showed you, but this is the general layout of what you're going to want to do. And of course, you can add different parallel effects and create some just insane sounds that one wouldn't think is possible. But I think half the fun is exploring the different amp models and cabinets and drive pedals and configurations that you can do on your own. I just wanted to give a quick little introductory of the general layout for those that may be lost in the world of amp modelers, because I don't think it's a very hard thing to do when you're jumping in, and you know, some people may have skipped out completely on some of the other technologies because this is such a good proposition value, and I thought this might be valuable. I'll put a variation of this patch below in the description for you to download. And with that said, back to me. Hope you enjoyed that little crash course in AX8 patch creation. Be sure to stick around, because in the near future we're going to be revisiting this piece of hardware to try to capture some other famous players' tones the same way we're doing with the free VST series, and other things such as importing custom cabinet impulse responses, among other things that I'm not quite ready to share yet. But hope you enjoyed that. Let me know below if you have any questions, as always, and hopefully we'll see you sooner rather than later with some more awesome tone creation via Fractal Audio. Thanks for watching. Bye.